Okay, welcome to more Visual Elements of Photography with Miss Lucas. Today we are going to be talking about focus and depth of field, which is going to be talking about the focus of your photos. So how sharp are your images? Do they look softer and fuzzy, or do they look really sharp and you can see everything with clean lines? We're also going to be talking about depth of field is going to be talking more about the focus of items and subjects in terms of how close they are to the camera. And then we're going to wrap everything up with setting up a frame and composition. So you are going to have a total of 6 terms for today. Okay, so let's start off with the simple stuff. Sharp overall is when everything in the photo is sharp. Everything is within focus. We can see everything very clearly. Nothing looks soft or hazy. So, and that's including everything in the foreground and the background. So if you look toward the background back here, where you can see the brick wall, we don't see just the fuzzy wall. We can see those bricks. We can see the details in the balcony here. We can see the details on the statue, and we can see all of these leaves here on the arches that are in the foreground. So everything is completely sharp throughout the whole image. We're gonna revisiting this deep space photo from our talk about space and perspective. This deep space photo is sharp overall because even though we have to squint to see that radio tower in the background, nothing is out of focus. Everything here is sharp overall and in focus. Again, looking at this shallow space example, everything is in focus. We can make out the texture on the wall. We can see all of the bananas, the rods on the window at the top. We can see all the apples. We can see the details on the crate, even individual nails that make it up. So everything is sharp and in focus. Then we have soft focus, and this is going to be a great one to Google for a lot of you guys. So soft focus is usually attained through a filter. It's when the entire image appears very soft, not quite fuzzy, just soft looking, and highlights may end up glowing. So it kind of looks like a light is coming from the subject itself. So in this example here, you can see on the top, we have a photo where the subject's face is in focus and the rest of her is in soft focus. However, on the bottom, you can see that a filter has been applied to give a softer focus to her face. So if you look at the details that we lose here, she has softer lines that make up her dimples and softer shadows on her face. She also has her eyelashes are a little bit more subtle. So the blacks don't stick out quite as much and the whites are a little bit dulled. And that's what creates this kind of glowing effect on the subject. So soft focus is going to be a great option to Google for a lot of you because you have to apply a filter to be able to attain this. Here's another great photo with quite a soft focus going on. So the background is so out of focus that we really can't make anything out whatsoever. But that flower that is the subject has these very soft edges that are really clearly defined in the middle of the flower and then on all the petals, where you can see this soft, almost kind of halo coming off of it. And soft focus doesn't necessarily mean that something is out of focus. So here we have the examples. So on the left, we have a sharp overall photo of the subject. On the far right, we have a soft focus. So we can still make out everything very clearly. You can still see the pupils of her eyes. It's just got a softer edge to it. Versus the middle, this is completely out of focus. So you can see that that blur around her, it's truly blurry. Okay, so soft focus gives us a soft line that looks like a glow, and out of focus is just a complete blur. So the best way to tell here is by looking at the subject's eyes. When it's out of focus, the pupil in the middle kind of bleeds out into her iris. versus the soft focus, we can still make out the pupil very clearly, separate from the iris, but not as clearly as in focus. Okay, so out of focus photos are just bad photos. They are not soft focus. Now we have selective focus, which is a blend between the two. So selective focus is going to have the subject completely sharp in focus, and everything in the background is going to be soft focus. So here, the subject is the fly on this stem. So everything in the foreground, the fly and the stem, are in focus sharp, whereas the background is just this soft kind of glow. It's so out of focus that it creates a gradient. So that's going to be selective focus when you really can't make out the other part of the image. You can only make out a selective part of it. This is going to be another good one to Google unless you are really good at taking photos on your phone. Here we have another selective focus where the subject is going to be these little flowers, their leaves, and the stem are all selectively focused and are sharp. And all of the rest of the flowers in the bush behind it are all completely soft. Slash out of focus. And this is something that is easily accomplished with a DSLR camera because the lens will focus on one thing at a time. But your phone is designed to take photos as sharp overall, not selective and not soft. So now I'm going to show you two examples of different types of selective focus. So here, the fence in the foreground is what is not in focus, and the camera is focused on this man's legs in the background and the stone wall that he's sitting behind. And then by contrast, now we have a selective focus image where the foreground is what is in focus and the background is not. So selective focus can be selective on the background and not the foreground, or the foreground and not the background, but never both. Now we have the trickiest one, which is shallow depth of field. And this is where we're focusing on even more specific parts of the photo. So whereas before in selective focus, we were talking about the fly on the stem, the fly and the stem were both in focus there. With shallow depth of field, only parts of the fly are in focus, not even its whole body. So here you can see that the only parts of the fly that are in focus are its face and eyes, but its legs and the stem and even the back of its body here are all much softer. So we define this as fewer planes that are in focus. So generally you have a subject and you're only focusing on a small component of that subject. This is accomplished because it appears to be a very short distance between the nearest and farthest areas of focus. So in this case, that very short distance is literally from this bug's eyes down to its legs immediately below. Here we have another example with Diet Coke. So normally these 3 Diet Coke cans would be the subject of this photo. However, in this shallow depth of field, the camera is only focused on one of those 3 cans, making it a shallow depth of field example. And when we're doing shallow depth of field with photography on people, you can see that on this baby's face, his eyes, nose, eyebrows, and mouth are all in focus, and then part of his hair up here. But as soon as your eye starts to move to the outside of him, you see that soft focus halo. So his shoulders, his ears, and his hair are all not within focus, which makes it a shallow depth of field. Again, here we have hands of an adult holding baby feet. This part here is what's in focus. These 3 fingers, or 4 fingers, I should say, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the feet. By the time we get to the pinky finger out here and the baby's legs, we are not within focus anymore. On this example, the rings are the shallow depth of field of what is in focus. And then by the time your eye comes out here to these little toes, you realize that they have that soft edge of not being in focus. So just part of the subject, not the whole. Okay, continuing on depth of field. Now we have an extensive depth of field, which is going to be the opposite of shallow. So that means that there seems to be a considerable distance between the nearest and farthest item that's in focus. So many planes are in focus. Extensive depth of field and sharp overall will overlap 99% of the time, because a sharp overall photo usually has a foreground, middle, and background in order to define. So an extensive depth of field is going to be a deep space photo that is completely sharp overall. So by combining those two terms, you get an extensive depth of field. Again, make sure that you are not using the same photo for two different terms. You need to have a different photo for each one. Some photos may work for multiple terms, so it's good to have backups that work for others. So here we have some examples of an extensive depth of field here in the bottom right-hand corner. Everything is in focus. But as we bring the background out of focus in this one, this is going to be selective focus because we're only focused on the hat and the sunglasses that are both in the foreground. This top right is going to be a soft focus because everything looks much softer. And then the top left over here is going to be a shallow depth of field because we're only focused on the sunglasses and the hat is now out of focus. So when you see all of these together, you can see just how different they can actually look. Here we have another case of sharp overall versus a selective focus, or shallow depth of field, depending on how you're looking at it with the muffins. Now we have another, this is a true extensive depth of field because we're looking all the way up the stairs and you can see the individual blades of grass all the way up this hill. So because we can see all of that detail, this is sharp overall and a deep space, which makes it extensive focus. Okay, our last term is going to be about your frame and composition. And this one is going to have little to do with the rest of what we just discussed. But this is going to be where you choose to put your subject in your photograph. As a rule of thumb, we never want to put our subject smack dab in the middle of our photograph. It's always good to put them off to the side or to the top or the bottom. So how the edges of the photograph meet the shapes and image to set up a frame within the photograph is frame and composition. So here on the example, you can see good and bad. At the top, we have bad. The subject is smack dab in the middle of the photo. And this brick wall is almost toward the middle of the photo. So it's kind of splitting the background in half. A better way of taking this photo is to have the subject lean against the brick wall and take the photo from the angle of the brick wall. Here you can see the brick wall is consuming over half of the image, and it frames and it brings the eye straight over to the subject over here on the left, taking up the remainder part. There is no dead space in this photo. So here we have an animation that shows what we're talking about here. And what true frame and composition is what we call the rule of thirds. So here we have a rock formation in the desert. And from the animation that keeps popping up, you can see a grid that puts the photo into thirds, 3 blocks up and down and 3 blocks left to right. we really do not want the subject to land in that middle block because that is the dead center of the photograph. Instead, we want the subject to fall somewhere along the lines on the left or the right, in the top and the bottom. This also goes for the horizon line. You guys can see that on the left, when the grid pops up, the horizon line is smack dab in the middle of the middle blocks. Whereas on the image on the right, the horizon line lines up with the bottom third line of the grid. We want to always make sure that we are keeping this in mind so that we are showing either 2/3 sky and 1/3 land, or 1/3 sky and 2/3 land. And the image should be aligned to either the left or the right for the subject, but never in the middle. Here you can see another image of the rule of thirds with a man sitting in a coffee shop. He is aligned with the third here on the side, and his body fits completely within this 2/3 of the photo. That gives us this other third to see the atmosphere around him and the environment in which his photo is being taken. Also note that no part of his body is cropped out here. We didn't crop the hand, we didn't crop the elbow or the top of his head. Instead, he's being photographed from the waist up. We generally want to photograph from the shoulders up, the waist up, or the entire body. And that's it for the rule of thirds. Remember this animation, guys. This is really, really important. Whenever you're taking a photo, try to imagine this grid in your head and make sure that what you are drawing fits this grid. When you take your photo for this, if you need help making sure that your photo falls within the rule of thirds, feel free to use the line feature in Google Slides to add lines on top of your photo. But this should be an easy one that you should be able to either take or crop an existing photo to make sure that it follows the rule of thirds. And that is it for focus and depth of field.